Anacortes, Washington. Population 16,681. A city full of local businesses, docked boats, and extraordinary views. However, underneath all of that is a story. A rich history with more connections to the modern day than you would think. This is Anacortes. In the early days of Anacortes, the city was less focused on tourism and service, and more focused on timber and canning. Once being hailed as the New York of the West by its founder, the bust of 1893 left many people scrambling to get out of town, leaving paintings to cover hotel bills and once shining railways abandoned. The fish in the trees really saved the city, with two major spots still having an impact today. The first is the Fidalgo Island Packing Company, canning salmon out of Ship Harbor between 1894 and 1925. The second has been replaced with boat launches, education centers, and Seafarers Memorial Park, but its roots have still taken hold today.
We're going to head to the site of the entrance to the old pulp mill. In the early years, in the 40s, especially before and during World War II, nobody drove because there was no gasoline. In World War II, the gas was rationed, and everybody walked to work. So the idea was you needed to live close enough to work to walk. They simply didn't have.
With almost 80 people employed at the time of its closure in 1978, the Scott Paper Mill was an integral part of Anacortes' economy throughout the 1900s. Gib Moore spent a large amount of time here as a night watchman, but his family connection runs deeper than that, as he told us in this interview. Do you mind giving a little bit of background information on yourself? How long you've lived here? What brought your family to Anacortes?
Yeah, I call myself a native. I was born in 1938. I grew up within half a mile of the boat mill on 20th Street. I graduated from Anacortes High School in 1956. Worked at the pulp mill on college vacations as a night watchman. There were some pretty bad jobs down there. Physically grueling jobs. The mill was sort of a family of workers. They were closer than you might see workers today, and so it was a kind of a cohesiveness, and we're all in this together, and we're doing these things great. We could do these things better, and let's try to improve on that. And it was a little psychological production report.
The kind of atmosphere at the time with the workers at the pulp mill was more of kind of a close-knit group of friends rather than just separate workers?
It was excellent, yeah, it was excellent. And the mutual respect for the workers and management, and there were enough Scott Paper activities that included families, like we had a Christmas party every year that was amazing, and kids got gifts, and
big celebration.
The wives all got a turkey, and they all got a box of chocolates, and so it was really cool. And I hated to turn 12 years old because that was the last time I got a gift. 17th Street, as we saw before, was the entrance to the mill. The mill workers came through this route. If you wanted to go to the office, or if you wanted to do business with the pulp mill, you came in that route. The office was about 100 yards up that way, and the entire mill then was laid out to the north with the digesters and the processing units to take care of the wet pulp and dry it and then bale it. Over here to the south was where the post-Morrison Mill wood yard was, where they would truck in logs and process them and make them into chips.
You've recounted stories of just how big this place was, but seeing just this vacant lot and actually kind of being in it is just really giving me a sense of scale of how big this operation actually was.
Yeah, it was big, yeah.
Formerly known as the Morrison Mill, it produced pulp out of alderwood. That pulp was shipped down to Scott's Everett branch to be made into things you would see in a department store, such as cardboard and toilet paper. The mill also produced an economic growth for Anacortes, with an annual payroll of around $1 million for all of its employees, most of which went back into the city itself. Public improvements, such as the construction of what's now Coslin Park, were funded in a major part by the tax dollars from the mill and its workers.
We made pulp out of alder logs, and mostly alder, short fibered pulp, which is what makes toilet paper soft. Logs would come into the wood yard. They'd go through a barking process, took all the bark off the log. You'd go into this big chipper, and like that, a 20-foot log was just a pile of chips. Then it would be, by conveyor belt, would go out and eventually end up going into a digester. The chips would go in, acid would go in, and the steam would be applied. After cooking it for 4.5 hours, whatever, then it was pumped or blown out into what they called the blow pits. Then they had a monitor, which is like a big fire hose, and the guy would handle it, and he'd wash this pulp down. And at this time, the pulp is more like oatmeal in color.
Yeah, well, kind of a pink.
Well, I'm colorblind. Maybe it was pink.
No, it was kind of a pinkish.
The pulp would be, as it's being mixed with water, would be pumped. It would go to a tank where the knots would be pulled out. It was a screens that would take the knots out and other imperfections, metal, and that would go to what they used to call Digby's Pond, which used to be the big white pond that sat outside. But then it would go to the bleach plant after it was screened, so the knots were out. And from the bleach plant, it would go through a bleach, chlorine, and lime. So this would partially break down the pulp and bleach it. Then it would be pumped to what we call wet machines. We had two, and wet machines were a series of machines with felts on them, just like a felt hat, only a little different. But water would be sucked out of it. It would go over this felt.
And a vacuum pan.
Yeah.
And the felts would go over the vacuum pan, and the pulp would fall on it, and it would be suck the water out into the vacuum pan.
Yeah, and then there was a sheet.
And it was a sheet of paper, heavy, real heavy paper. In the earlier years, it came out of a baler the size of a hay bale and weighed about 300 pounds. They went to the paper machine in Everett, the paper mill in Everett.
People felt they had a commitment to the mill too. It wasn't like that's theirs and I just come here and go to work. It was a completely different philosophy than what I saw when I moved away from here. Everybody, even though they were maybe protective of their own jobs, which was normal, they were very protective of the mill. They knew, or at least we knew, we felt we knew, when management told us, hey, we got a problem, it was something that we needed to do something about. And the same thing happened the other way. If we felt that the workers had a problem, there was not a problem of getting that discussed. And so it was quite I think a unique situation. The mill worked with the community, but the community of people that were there were very supportive of the mill. And as I said, I worked other places and I've never seen that kind of cooperation and understanding between the two.
This paints the Scott Paper Mill in a light that gives it no downsides, and for a time there weren't any, other than the smell that permeated the air of Anacortes. It wasn't until the mill's closure that the environmental effects would start to crop up. So would you mind giving us some of the chemicals that were present at the site of the Scott Paper Pulp Mill that were causing problems in the area?
So during the process of a pulp mill, they used a lot of different chemicals in those operations, and those things were just washed off the sidewalks into the bay. And so they had a number of different toxicants that are, lethal in the environment and whatnot. In fact, in discussions with John Tersey, who worked at the mill, he used to work out on the log booms in the mill. He said they would often find a lot of dead fish floating in the water there. And on occasion, he actually fell in the water, and he said it would burn his mouth and he'd have a sore throat and things like that. So they were pretty hazardous chemicals.
Most of those things are either banned or pretty heavily regulated.
Yes,
right about
they
now,
are.
right?
They are indeed.
Would you say that the public was very invested in getting this area cleaned up, or?
I don't think there was a lot of public knowledge about it, frankly. When I first started working on the grant I had with the Department of Ecology, which was specifically targeted at increasing public understanding and participation in the cleanup work, what I found was that most people had no idea that there was really an issue, other than the visual image of, the old materials on the shore and things like that. But the actual toxic danger to people and things, I don't think there was a lot of awareness to that. I think that the renovation of the marina and the Seafarers Park sort of triggered a chain of events. And it just fell into place with a program that the Washington Department of Ecology was starting up at that point, which was called the Baywide Cleanup Program. Instead of, as they had in the past, going and cleaning up a site somewhere, they started to take a more holistic view, where if you had an entire bay, like Fidalgo Bay, where you had multiple contaminated sites, it made a lot more sense to look at it as an integrated project, where you would clean up all of those sites and restore the habitats and the ecosystem in a holistic sense.
Like a clean sweep rather than just spot by spot by spot.
Right.
The treatment for the Scott Paper Mill site started near the end of 2005, which included disposal of contaminated driftwood, decontamination of groundwater, and other renovations around the Seafarers Memorial Park area. The treatment concluded in 2011, but the Washington Department of Ecology is contracted to monitor the site until 2021 for toxins and debris, allowing for the revival of plants and wildlife in the area.
The other participants in the Pulp Mill exhibit will all agree it was a really great place to work, and it's part of our social and economic and cultural history, and there's towns all over like this that have gone through this evolution of using the natural resources, and then those natural resources kind of dry up, and we adapt and move on.